Imagine the real beast from Beauty, and the beast was once locked in a cage as a child and fed like an animal. This isn't the whimsical Disney fantasy we grew up with. This is the haunting true story buried in royal records, medical journals, and painted portraits. And the ending? It's far from happily ever after. We all know Beauty and the Beast, the cursed prince trapped in a monstrous form, the brave girl who sees beyond appearances, and the transformative power of love that breaks the spell. Disney's beloved 1991 animated classic painted this story in warm colors and soaring melodies, giving us one of the most romantic fairy tales ever told. But the version Disney gave us, and even the French literary versions that came before it, may trace their roots to something much darker. Not a magical curse, but a real man with a real condition, living in a world that saw him as a beast to be caged, studied, and displayed for the amusement of royalty. His name was Petrus Gonsalvus, born around 1537 on the Canary Islands. From birth, Petrus lived with hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition also known as werewolf syndrome that causes thick hair to grow all over the body and face. In an age when medical knowledge was primitive and superstition ruled, this condition marked him as something inhuman. To 16th century Europeans, Petrus was not seen as a child with a medical condition. He was viewed as a curiosity, a freak of nature, perhaps even something demonic. At just 10 years old, this boy was captured, caged like a wild animal, and shipped across the ocean to France as an exotic gift for King Henry II. The French court expected a savage beast when the cage arrived. What they found instead was a frightened child who could speak, and more surprisingly, who could learn. Petrus spoke Latin and showed remarkable intelligence, shattering their preconceptions about what lay beneath his unusual appearance. Rather than release the boy, the royal court made a different choice. They decided to educate Petrus, teaching him to read, write, and behave like nobility. He was dressed in fine velvet, given tutors, and trained in court etiquette. To observers, this might have seemed like an act of enlightened kindness. But make no mistake, this wasn't compassion. Petrus had become a living curiosity, a courtly pet whose education only made him more fascinating to the nobles who gathered to gawk at him. He was the ultimate conversation piece, a wild man who could quote poetry, a beast who could dance at royal balls. He was marveled at and celebrated, but never truly accepted. No matter how refined his manners or eloquent his speech, Petrus remained an object of fascination rather than a person deserving of dignity. He lived in gilded captivity, admired, but never embraced as an equal. Years later, after King Henry II's death, his widow Catherine de' Medici took a particular interest in Petrus. In what can only be described as a twisted social experiment, she arranged a marriage for him. The bride was Catherine, a court servant chosen not for love or compatibility, but for scientific curiosity. Catherine de' Medici wanted to see what would happen when Petrus married. Would their children inherit his condition? Would they be normal, or would they too be covered in hair? This wasn't romance. It was eugenics dressed up in wedding finery, a real-life breeding experiment conducted in the halls of French royalty. The marriage, surprisingly, seems to have been a genuine partnership. Despite the circumstances of their union, Petrus and Catherine developed what appears to have been a loving relationship. But even their most intimate moments were subject to royal scrutiny and scientific interest. Over the years, Petrus and Catherine had 7 children together. 4 of them inherited their father's hypertrichosis, while 3 appeared normal. For most families, this would be a private matter. For the Gonsalvus family, it became the source of unimaginable tragedy. Their children were not allowed to simply be children. Those with hypertrichosis were particularly prized, not as beloved offspring, but as living collectibles. European nobles began requesting their hairy children as gifts, and the French court obliged. 4 of Petrus and Catherine's children were literally given away to royal courts across Europe. These children weren't adopted into loving families. They weren't offered opportunities for education or marriage. Instead, they were displayed as curiosities, studied like specimens, and paraded before guests as living examples of nature's oddities. Beautiful oil paintings survive, showing these wild children dressed in lace collars and fine clothing, but catalogued and presented like rare animals in a menagerie. Imagine the heartbreak of Petrus and Catherine, watching their children taken from them and scattered across the continent. Imagine the trauma of those children, raised not as heirs to noble houses, but as living exhibitions, forever separated from their parents and siblings. What makes this story even more chilling is that extensive documentation survives. Portraits of the Gonsalvus family were commissioned by various European courts, creating a visual record of their lives. These paintings, now housed in museums across Europe, show Petrus in rich clothing, Catherine by his side, and their children arranged around them. But look closely at these portraits, and you'll notice something unsettling. While the family is painted with obvious care and attention to detail, there's something clinical about the way they're presented. These aren't family portraits in the traditional sense. They're documentary evidence of a scientific curiosity. The artists captured not just their appearance, but their condition, creating a permanent record of the wild family for posterity. Some of the most haunting images show the children alone, dressed as little nobles, but clearly identified by their condition. These portraits were likely created as gifts for the courts that received them, visual proof of their exotic new acquisitions. Eventually, Petrus and Catherine found themselves in Parma, Italy, under the protection of Duke Ranuccio Farnese. Here, in their later years, they lived on a quiet estate, together at last, but still technically owned by their noble patron. This period of their lives remains largely undocumented. There are no letters from Petrus revealing his thoughts about his extraordinary life. No diary entries from Catherine describing her feelings about watching her children taken from her. Just names in ledgers, brief mentions in court records, and the fading memory of a family that had been scattered across Europe for the entertainment of the wealthy. They aged in relative peace, but they were never truly free. Even in their final refuge, they remained curiosities, albeit comfortable ones. Their story gradually faded from immediate memory, but elements of their lives would echo through European folklore and eventually inspire the fairy tales we know today. The transformation of Petrus and Catherine's story into Beauty and the Beast represents one of literature's most profound acts of sanitization. The real horror, the systematic dehumanization of a family, the trafficking of children as living curiosities, the reduction of human beings to objects of entertainment, was carefully scrubbed away. In its place, we got a story about the transformative power of love, where the beast becomes a prince and everyone lives happily ever after. It's a beautiful story, but it erases the suffering of real people who lived and loved and lost in ways that fairy tales could never capture. For decades, Petrus and Catherine lived in the margins of high society, admired and even loved by some, but never free to live their own lives or protect their own children. Their story should serve as a haunting reminder of how cruelty can hide behind fascination, how exploitation can masquerade as education, and how the most monstrous behavior often comes not from those who look different, but from those who treat others as less than human. Maybe the beast was never the real monster in this story after all.